The two combined are taken by 540 Dakotas and 1,300 tugs towing 1,300 gliders. So you've got an enormous force, and that's protected by 3,000 fighters. You basically got 5,000 planes in the air, all heading for this relatively small location of a few square miles in northern Germany, and watched, interesting enough, by Winston Churchill.
Hello. On the morning of the 24th of March, 1945, the British and Canadian 6th Airborne Division and the American 17th Airborne Division began parachuting into German-held territory on the eastern side of the River Rhine. So began the largest single-lift airborne operation of all time, as nearly 17,000 men were dropped using nearly 2,000 transport planes and defended by around 3,000 fighters. Varsity was the last major operation of the war, as the Allies successfully made it onto German-held territory and the route to Berlin was clear, though they were behind the Soviets in that race. Joining to discuss is Saul David, best-selling military historian and author of Sky Warriors, his account of the British airborne troops during the Second World War. If you can share this pod with family and friends, I'd be most grateful, and please do give a kind or even generous rating, but in the meantime it's me talking with Saul David on Operation Varsity. Saul, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me.
Delighted to be back, Ol. And we should mention, shouldn't we, the great news that you've recently had. You're joining the ranks of the historians.
Well, I haven't signed a contract yet, so I don't want to tempt fate. But yes.
Exciting.
Thank you for revealing that to the listeners.
They'll be very keen to know that you'll be on the other side of the microphone very soon when people are interviewing you about the story.
Yeah, well, hopefully if they're interested. But yeah, so but look, Saul, it's not about me, it's about you today. Okay? And so for listeners who are wondering what we're talking about, it's Operation Varsity. They'll have seen that from the title. And this is a key moment in your book, Sky Warriors, Saul. And so last time we spoke, you were discussing the disaster that was Operation Market Garden. And happily, this is a slightly better story. Although I've been reading it and it didn't, I mean, we can get onto the detail and the lay of the land and who's where in the Western Front, or the Germans' Western Front and the Allies as they're advancing into Germany. But just reading the actual landing zone, which we can get onto, it wasn't completely straightforward. But it was the largest airborne landing. Is it the largest airborne landing of all time?
In a single day. I mean, that's why some people say, well, hold on a second, surely more airborne forces in total were used for the Arnhem operation or the Market Garden, I suppose you'd call it more generally, including the Americans. But actually, to all come in a single lift, it was the biggest single operation, the airborne operation in history.
Okay. And it's sort of fairly similar in that they fly from England, as with Market Garden. But could you just sort of, just for the sake of the listeners, just show the state of play at the time? I should remind listeners and you, Saul, because I know you're an avid listener of this podcast, that we've had Philip Blood on talking about Aachen, the Battle of Aachen, and then we had Philip and Gordon Corrigan discussing the Battle of the Bulge. So listeners will be sort of pretty up to speed on what's been going on as we move through 44 into 45.
Yeah, so the events we're discussing take place, or at least the operation begins on the 24th of March, 1945. But if we backtrack to the end of Bulge, which is towards the end of January 1945, you've got a key meeting between Eisenhower and his senior commanders in which they've got to decide what to do next. And at this point, Monty, who's commanding the army group in the north, and you've got Bradley further to the south, is saying, listen, I need most of the resources in my area. I think the key breakthrough is going to be in the north. It'll be easiest to advance over the northern plains of Germany, and I can get to Berlin before the Russians. Now, the story of why they don't get to Berlin is a separate story, but all we that is the listeners need to know at this stage, is that Monty's very keen to get as many supplies as he can to get across the Rhine and get moving as quickly as possible. The response from Ike is interesting because on the surface, he says, absolutely not. We're going to continue with our broad front strategy. That is, both army groups are going to continue advancing at roughly the same rate. Yet, nevertheless, he does what he often does with Monty, which is he throws him a bone or two by saying, actually, you're going to have the bulk of resources for your operation to get across the Rhine. And that includes adding an army, which is basically he's inherited since the end of the Bulge operation. And that's the US Ninth Army. So it's a slightly expanded army group that's going to go across the Rhine. But what's interesting when we get to the actual operation itself is that Monty's thinking, I'm going to be the first one across the Rhine. In reality, what's happened further to the south, both at Remagen, which is where the famous crossing of the Rhine at Remagen, but it was one of those kind of happenstance moments where they don't actually intend to go across. They just see an opportunity and they take it and they grab the bridge before the Germans can actually stop them. So they get across there. Meanwhile, Patton's, that's on the 7th of March. Meanwhile, Patton gets across a little bit further south at Oppenheim on the 22nd. So you've already got these two bridgeheads across the Rhine before they launch Operation Varsity, which takes place, as I said, on the 24th. Now, this is a combined operation. So just like Market Garden was air and land, this one is even more complicated. It's air, but also amphibious. So there's going to be a crossing across there's going to be an amphibious crossing of the Rhine. And at the same time, airborne troops are going to land on the east bank to obviously assist in that crossing.
And crossing the Rhine, presumably the Germans know the Rhine's quite important, so they've reinforced the other side of the bank. I mean, amphibious crossing, as we know from Market Garden, can be very costly, can't it?
I mean, the problem for the Germans is that they're relatively thinly spread. But yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, amphibious crossing of a river is one of the hardest things to do. It's interesting. I was reading, this is a bit of an aside here, Ol, but I'll mention it. I was reading Sun Tzu recently. I was doing a class with a few other people. And Sun Tzu makes the point, never try and defend a river crossing. What you actually should do is defend the high ground on the far bank. So if you think about the Meuse in 1940, where the Germans get across and the French are actually trying to defend the river bank, and once they're through those defenses, they're into the open. Well, that's exactly what Sun Tzu was saying. Don't try and defend a riverbank. You've got to defend key tactical ground further away from the river. And best case scenario, the enemy crosses, then tries to take your high ground. You're in an advantageous position and they've got a river at their backs, which is not what you want to be if you're being attacked. So you can see a river can be taken either way. Some people think it's a great, natural obstacle to stop a defense, to stop an attack. And other people, Sun Tzu included, theorists, think it's a bit of a death trap, actually, if you try and defend a riverbank. But in any case, that's what the Germans were trying to do. They were using their normal tactics because they were a bit spread, a bit thin with troops. And remember from the Bulge, as no doubt your contributors made the point, pretty much all of Germany's remaining armored forces and motorized forces are really frittered away in the Battle of the Bulge, it being, the last throw of the dice. So they're very undermanned in what the Germans always use and tried to use at D-Day, of course, not that successfully, which is its motorized and armored troops to counterattack once any enemies made an initial incursion. And that's exactly the plan they had for the crossing of the Rhine. So they've got a relatively thin crust defending the Rhine itself, but they've got a strategic reserve a little bit further back. But in the case of the First Parachute Army, which was the army defending the sector that Monty's attacking with Operation Plunder Varsity, there are only about 70,000 German troops, and not all of those are kind of front line, and only a couple of panzer divisions, well, a Panzer Grenadier division and a panzer division. So the hitting power from what the Germans have got available is not very powerful. The whole point of the airborne operation is it's designed to interdict a counterattack against an initial bridgehead over the Rhine. But the last point to make about in the planning stage is that they did try and learn a lot of the lessons from Arnhem, and they tried to make sure that the airborne plan they put in place was going to take account of those lessons.
Okay, and so what were some of the lessons then? I suppose don't drive up a single narrow road along a long distance. That's an important lesson.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't leave your airborne troops stranded either. And
yeah, well, that's the same point.
Right.
The the three key elements that they discovered after Arnhem, you've already pointed out one of them, which is that don't land your airborne troops too far away from the relieving ground forces. In the case of Varsity, the distance was going to be very short. They're going to land them a couple of miles beyond the river, and therefore the amphibious troops, once they've got across the river, have only got relatively short distance to link up. So that's the first thing they've learned. Second thing they're going to learn is they're not even going to launch the airborne operation until the troops are across the river. So there's no question that they could be stranded on both sides of the river, which is obviously a bit of a risk. And the third point is the one I've already hinted at, which is you get them all in one go. At Arnhem, there were 3 lifts going in on consecutive days, meaning the punching power of the airborne forces on day 1 was really just a brigade in the case of Arnhem. And that wasn't enough for them to get through to the bridge and actually secure the bridge. So you drop all the troops in one single go on the morning of the 24th of March, after the amphibious operation has already been judged to be a success, within artillery support of the main armies coming across the river. And therefore, as a result of all of this, there's no danger that they're going to be isolated. You do still have the basic problem of all airborne operations, which is as they're coming down and they decide to come in daylight, there was some question as to whether they were going to go at night. But night operations, it's very difficult to rally people in the right places. They tend to get dropped all over the place, as happened on the night of D-Day. So they make the decision to go in by daytime, but the risk, of course, is that you're going to be badly shot up as these slow-moving gliders and airborne troops are coming into their drop zones and landing zones.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is what I was just reading about in your book, in that, okay, so they decide to go during daylight hours, but D-Day was a success. I mean, yes, they did get scattered around, but surely, I mean, is it 6 of one, half a dozen the other? I would have thought you would go with D-Day, where it was at night, and that was a success, whereas Market Garden during the day, less successful.
The other key element, one I've already talked about, which is why I agree with you. I think there's absolutely no reason why because the whole point about D-Day is that although all the right people didn't get to the right places, pretty much all the objectives were secured and it was a successful operation. So why not try to repeat the success of that? The problem you've got is in the timing. If you're going to go in after they made a successful crossing of the Rhine, you've got to wait for that operation to happen. And that was designed at night because it is incredibly dangerous to cross a river during the daytime, which is what the Americans did when they finally got across and managed to take the far side of the bridge at Nijmegen. But they took very, very heavy casualties in doing that because, of course, you're sitting ducks as you're coming across the water. If you cross at night, which is the plan for plunder, then you can get across with relatively little opposition and defensive fire because you're covered by darkness. So I think that was the point. You could argue, yes, they could have done it, I don't know, around about midnight and then hope to get the guys in just before first light in the morning, but they decided against that. And the first planes aren't actually scheduled to land until 10 a.m. in the morning.
Okay, and then we should talk a little bit about the 6th Airborne Division, who are the guys going in, because I mean, the 1st Airborne Division, there's not much left of them after Market Gardens, but the 6th Airborne are the D-Day veterans, aren't they? So we may recognise a few characters from that earlier operation.
Yeah, Oxenbuck's light infantry, famously D Company captures Pegasus Bridge. That's one of the components of the 6th Air Landing Brigade, which was used at D-Day. The 2 parachute brigades, 5th and 7th, 3rd and 5th parachute brigades, also veterans of Normandy. So you've got, in effect, the A team. I mean, the 1st Airborne Division were very upset that they didn't do the D-Day operation. They felt they were more experienced, but having done it, 6th Airborne Division were the best we had to go with. And of course, as you've already pointed out, Ollie, the 1st Airborne Division is pretty much destroyed. It has been rebuilt since the Arnhem operation, but of course it's lost a lot of its veterans and particularly its best officers, people like Frost, who was commanding the 2nd Battalion. So you've got a lot of relatively untried. Some people were brought back from the 6th Airborne to stiffen the 1st Airborne, but it was a relatively untried formation and green at this stage. And although the 1st Airborne is slated to carry out a number of airborne operations, as was the case between D-Day and Arnhem, there were an enormous number of airborne operations planned, and only one actually takes place, and that's this one.
Well, there's one character that I think you follow in the book called Alan Clements, and he actually was in both divisions, wasn't he? And you've got a bit of a treasure trove of letters that he wrote to his sister.
Yeah, it was wonderful material, actually. I think I found the Clements papers in the Imperial War Museum, and I was amazed. I'd never seen them in any airborne book before. And he writes a number of letters, which, when you discover, as we discuss what's going to happen next, you discover his fate. They become even more poignant. And of course, from the purposes of telling the airborne story, which Sky Warriors tries to from the beginning to the end, as it were, he's there pretty much the whole way through. He goes to North Africa and takes part in the first operational drop by the 1st Parachute Battalion. So he's with what will become the 1st Airborne Division in 1942. He's one of the pioneers, basically. And he's been all the way through. He narrowly misses Arnhem, actually, because he transfers out of the 1st to the 6th. But of course, having done now in the 6th and ready to go for this final operation. And you can see in his letters he's writing just before, so we got something big about to happen. Does he have a premonition of his death? Not per se, but any airborne soldier and officer going in knows that the chances of them coming out in one piece was always smaller than for a normal soldier going into a normal combat operation. The casualties for airborne all the way through the war incredibly high. They're all volunteers trained to a very high standard. But yeah, it was particularly sad for me because as I was reading through the documents, I didn't know what was going to happen next, and I kind of got closer and closer, and I got this kind of sense of foreboding as I was reading through his last few letters, and not least because they suddenly stop.
Right. The drop, to me, reading it, I don't know what the numbers were lost on the sort of first few hours, but they're getting shot at because it's daylight by the Germans as they descend. And it's rather heartbreaking to read. I mean, you see this depicted in film sometimes. It's awful watching, because you're helpless. You're just going down at a fairly slow speed and just getting cut up by small arms fire.
That's right, and flak too. I mean, they're firing these very effective. They had a lot of flak over this area. The one thing the Germans seem to have right to the end of the war, actually, not least because they put a lot of resources into it, is to flak. I mean, they're using the flak as a defense against bombers, but they can be just as easily used for to counter an operation of this type. Just to give the bigger picture of how many planes were actually involved, because you just imagine the sight this must have been as they're coming over from the UK. The first of the 240 Dakota transport planes, that's carrying the 6th battalions of the 2 British parachute brigades, take off at 7 a.m. on the 24th of March from their bases in the UK, as you said, actually in East Anglia. And they're followed into the air by 429 tugs. So already you've got 600, well, almost 700 planes taking the British component, and then you've also got the American component, which is interesting enough. We haven't mentioned that it's the 17th Airborne Division, which is a rookie formation as far as combat jumps are concerned. It's done a little bit of fighting in the Bulge. I don't know if it was mentioned at all. I know there were so many forces that were actually used in the Bulge, so probably it wasn't referenced by your guys, but it had got a bit of combat experience there. And of course, they're raring to get into action. The two combined are taken by 540 Dakotas and 1,300 tugs towing 1,300 gliders. So you've got an enormous force, and that's protected by 3,000 fighters. You've basically got 5,000 planes in the air, all heading for this relatively small location of a few square miles in northern Germany, and watched, interesting enough, by Winston Churchill, who's with Monty at his tactical HQ. And I'll just read you the quote from Churchill because it's quite nice. I mean,
can you do that in a Churchillian voice as well, please, Saul?
Listen, I know James Holland and Al Murray and one or two other hosts of podcasts and contributors to podcasts are very keen to do the accents. I'm not so keen.
Okay.
I'll do it in my usual voice, but it's rather lovely, and this appears in his history of the Second World War, of course. It was full daylight, he wrote, before the subdued but intense roar and rumbling of swarms of aircraft stole upon us. After that, in the course of half an hour, over 2,000 aircraft streamed overhead in their formations. Soon they returned at a different altitude, having dropped their parachutists and released their gliders. And I witnessed with a sense of tragedy aircraft in 2s and 3s coming back askew, a smoke, or even in flames. I'm not sure a smoke is a word, but it's rather a lovely description, isn't it, of what he must have seen. And that is the start of the operation, as you say, Ol, as the first parachutes are dropped just before 10 a.m. in the morning. They're met by this pretty heavy storm of fire. I mean, one of them in particular, this is Hill's brigade. That's James Hill, one of the famous British parachuters of the Second World War, wins 4 DSOs. No VC, but 4 DSOs. He's parachuting down with his brigade HQ, which includes Alan Clements, who you mentioned before, and his 8th Battalion, and they descend into a hail of small arms fire on the edge of the Dietz-Forter forest. And there's one, just to give you a sense of what it was like from the German side, there's one German Panzer Grenadier called Rolf Siegel, who writes, "We pressed ourselves into our trenches. They didn't seem quite deep enough then." That's during the artillery barrage that precedes the attack, only to re-emerge as the first aircraft arrived. By the time that we had set up the gun, parachutists were in the air. Within a few minutes, there were hundreds of them, and many were collecting at various points. I'm sure we must have drawn attention to ourselves because one group fell on us quickly. Well, his gun was an MG-42, which is one of the most kind of formidable, fearsome bits of kit the Germans had, with a rate of fire, I think, of 1,200 rounds a minute. And it absolutely cut the parachuters who were coming down near it into pieces. He claimed to have shot up to 20 British parachuters before his post was overwhelmed, wounded by grenade fragments. He's taken prisoner. Now, it's interesting because he writes all of this later about his experiences, and that you can be damn sure he's not going to be telling anyone at the time that he shot 20 people, as he may not have survived himself.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show.
There were a few other little bits that I was reading that just really add great colour to it. For example, there's a sergeant who, a veteran of, was it D-Day? And he refuses to go on the jump and is stripped of his rank.
Yeah, so did they take him off the plane before? I can't remember if they take him off the plane before he even takes off, or whether he's arrested.
Yes,
basically.
he doesn't get on the plane.
Yeah, I mean, but this comes back to a broader point about war, Ollie, which is people can show tremendous bravery in a certain situation, but they can just have had their fill of it at a certain stage, which is at what point do you reach that level where you've got nothing more to give? And that was clearly the case from him. I mean, no one volunteers for the airborne troops unless they're incredibly brave in the first place because of what they're expected to do. Landed miles behind, or in this case, not too far behind enemy lines, but in any case, behind enemy lines in this very vulnerable situation. But I suppose the two stories that stand out for me actually involve the Canadians, and one is the death of Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Nicklin, who's commanding the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, which is part of the 6th Airborne Division, believe it or not. And the reason it's part of it is because they don't have a Canadian Parachute Brigade. They don't have enough battalions. So they basically lent them to the Brits. And we've added it to our order of battle. And poor old... the poor old commander, Nicklin, gets caught up in the trees as he's coming down. So he's completely vulnerable. He's trying to get out of his straps to drop to the ground, and he's riddled with fire by Germans on the ground. And you've also got the example killed during the drop, as I finally tell my readers, of this lovely character, Captain Alan Clements. Bookish, chess playing, quite an intellectual, who only 8 days earlier had told his sister how much he was enjoying life and the prospect of getting into combat again. And the War Office telegram that his family had been dreading finally reaches them on the 5th of April, which is not a couple of weeks after this. Shows you how long it took sometimes for the bad news to arrive. And it read, as of course they all did, or at least the ones to the officers: "Deeply regret to inform you of report received from Western Europe that Captain A.B. Clements, Army Air Corps, was killed in action on the 24th of March 1945. We don't know the exact circumstance of his death, but he died shortly after landing, so it's possible he was killed in a similar way to Nicklin."
Yeah, it's awful. I mean, the other thing I was reading is there's a Private Ernie Elvin who stumbles across a gun surrounded by just men from the 12th Battalion who are dead, but no mark on them at all, which is just so strange. I guess war throws up these odd instances.
Yeah, you do get these situations actually occasionally. I've seen a few instances of this in the Second World War where it seems like concussion from an exploding shell. Maybe they were within the blast range, as it were. So
like a
too
shockwave.
close. Yeah, so the shock wave is what kills them, and you can't see any outward sign on the body of the cause of their death. But of course, probably internally, the organs have all been messed around a bit. So it's pure speculation, but that is a thing in combat, particularly when you've got a lot of heavy artillery fire and large gauge guns being used. The other story I like, the other Canadian story, is the one about Corporal Topham, who's the only Canadian parachutist to win a VC during the Second World War, and indeed the only member of the 6th Airborne Division to win a VC. Of course, 5 were won by the 1st Airborne at Arnhem, but in this case, just one. And Topham is the most wonderful character. He'd been a gold prospector in Canada before the war, volunteered for the parachutists, but he's a medic. And so he's not trying to kill anyone. He's trying to save lives. And he does that repeatedly, even though he's wounded himself during the drop on the 24th of March. But the most famous incident is when he approaches a burning Bren gun carrier with ammunition on it, which is in the process of exploding. And he's basically told not to go near it, even though he can hear people on it wounded who are shouting out for rescue. And he ignores all the warnings and the obvious threat to his life, and manages to drag 3 people off this burning Bren gun carrier, extraordinary risk to himself, and saves the lives of 2 of them. And they almost certainly would have been left by everyone else who weren't moving a muscle to try and help them, maybe understandably. But it's a wonderful story, and Topham, gets one of the most deserved VCs, in my view, of the Second World War.
Incredible. It's amazing to think, particularly you've mentioned there were, was it 5 awarded during the Market Garden operation?
Yeah.
And none awarded during D-Day?
Well, just one awarded to D-Day. And this gets back to a point I think I've made probably to you, Ollie, and anyone who cares to listen, a number of times. And that is that how in situations when things don't go well, more VCs tend to be awarded because they're trying to obscure what has actually been a bit of a military balls up. So at Arnhem, you get 5 and only 1 for D-Day. D-Day is a great success, and none for the airborne troops, although extraordinary acts of heroism took place. So I think that is a bit of it's sad to say, but it is a bit of a theme in military history.
It needs to be a defeat, right? Well, it's interesting.
You're covering up the bad news, or you're
Exactly.
you're mitigating the bad news.
Well, speaking of bad news, I've just got back from the Imperial War Museum, the gallery there for the Victoria Cross and the George Cross, which is closing. So listeners, get to the Imperial War Museum before the 1st of June.
Absolutely scandalous decision. I don't know what's going on there. We're kind of reading between the lines. On the surface, it might be a little bit political, in inverted commas. I don't know what's going on there. But of course, the VCs have been donated by Ashcroft. The time was coming up at the end of the initial donation period, but he certainly and has gone on the record as saying he would happily have extended that. And they have chosen not to continue the extension of that loan period. So those 150, maybe more VCs that are in Ashcroft's possession, of course, won't be able to be seen because they'll be in a private collection hereafter, unless they go somewhere else, can no longer be seen by people. And the IWM's kind of, line was twofold. One, we came to the end of our period. Well, I've already dealt with that. That's not a reason not to continue. And 2, we've got lots of VCs of our own to show. Well, they've got a few. I don't know exactly how many, but they may have 10. They don't have 180 or 200. And it's a very short-sighted decision.
Agreed.
And a real shame.
I'll put a link in for listeners about a piece I wrote having visited it for you to have a look through. But right, let's get back to Varsity. Now, what we've just been talking about sort of hints at, was this a sort of an acceptable level of loss for senior commanders, landing in daylight? They knew this would happen. They just had to suck it up.
I think up to a point, yes. They don't necessarily expect to lose battalion commanders, but it can always happen, and it does happen here. I think the important thing to remember is that although we've been talking about the difficulty of getting on the ground, because obviously they're defensive troops below you, it's what they do next that's important, because you've got to get a lodgement, which they get, despite the fact that they take heavy casualties. And of course, a lot of the gliders are coming in. I've got a bit of footage actually Ollie, which I'll show you sometime, in which you can actually see one of the gliders coming in on fire. And this is footage that was taken on that day. So it's either been taken by the Germans, or it was taken by one of the British photographic film units. But in any case, you get a sense of the absolute chaos of the initial landing zone and how dangerous it was. But once the gliders have landed, they in particular have a very important job to do, which is to capture bridges across the Issel River. And the reason the job's been given to air landing as opposed to the parachutists is because they can land with more heavy weaponry, particularly anti-tank guns, because they're expecting the Germans to counterattack, which is what they were trying to do, or do on D-Day. And that's exactly what happened. So you get a particularly fierce fight on one of the bridges over the Issel between the 2nd Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, who were the unit, as I mentioned, that took Pegasus Bridge, and a lot of the same people involved. Not Howard, sadly, the great hero of Pegasus Bridge, because he's been badly wounded in a car accident and will never see combat again. But a lot of the guys that he's commanded, or at least the survivors of his company, are there fighting in this very tough fight for the Issel Bridge. And it goes back and forth. They're fighting against the 16th Panzer Division, the armor and half tracks of the 16th Panzer Division, and it's a very close run thing. In fact, on one bridge in particular, things get so desperate that they decide to blow the bridge, which obviously is going to stop the Germans counterattacking over the bridge, but it's not going to allow you to go the other way, which is the bit of an issue at Pegasus. That's exactly what would have happened at Pegasus if things had got too hot there. They probably would have blown the bridge, but in any case, they didn't need to. Here they did, but it just gives you a sense of the desperate nature of the fighting. That action by the 2nd Ox and Bucks Light Infantry stops the panzers getting to the rest of the amphibious bridgehead. So they undoubtedly played their part. The debate will always go on, I'm afraid, particularly when I talk about the number of casualties, as to whether it was worth it, whether they could have done the job with ground troops alone. In my personal view, and you might say, well, I would say this because I'm writing a book about airborne troops, I really think this was really well planned operation. Yes, the daylight thing was the one thing maybe they could have finessed a bit, but they learned a lot of the lessons of Arnhem. They carried out an almost flawless operation, and it was worth the expenditure in men. I mean, after all, when you think about it, Arnhem, they lose 8,000 out of 10,000. Here they lose about a third of the 5,000 British troops involved. So, and the Americans, similar sort of proportion, maybe just about 20%. Yes, they're heavy casualties, but airborne operations always are, unfortunately.
Right. And so how long are they actually fighting for before they can be relieved?
Well, they do actually link up with the troops coming across the river on the morning, in the afternoon of the 24th. So it's job done on the same day to a certain extent. They're not taken out of the line because they're holding defensive positions, and they remain in those defensive positions for another couple of days. But you could argue that in the first 24 hours, almost all the main objectives of the crossing of the Rhine have been met. You've got a serious number of troops across, and the Germans are not going to turf them back out the other side. So really, it's just a question of planning the breakout from that bridgehead thereafter.
And is that really then the last kind of major British operation of the war?
It is. There were a number planned, as I think I said. There was one called the Rhine, which was the biggest of the lot, and this aimed. We've never heard of it because it never took place, but it aimed to use both British airborne divisions. That's the 1st and the 6th, 4 U.S. airborne divisions, and 4 air transported U.S. infantry divisions. Those are sometimes known for the Germans, for example, as air landing divisions, to establish a fortress east of Paderborn in Western Germany, towards which Omar Bradley's 12th US Army group would then advance. So it's like a hedgehog they were going to create, and this is going to enable the advance to link up with them. It was cancelled because Eisenhower decided that the troops were advancing perfectly rapidly and they didn't need to risk an airborne operation thereafter. And what's interesting about this operation, Plunder and Varsity, is the advances from this point onwards are incredibly quick. We've got, barely a month or a few weeks later, you've got the meeting with the Russians on the Elbe River. So you can see how quickly they go over those next few hundred miles compared to the really brutal fighting to get close to and over the Rhine.
Well, Churchill may have been very worried about the Soviets, full stop. Was there any, and this is a bit of a left field question, but was there ever any kind of serious discussion of whether to send this huge force you've just mentioned for this cancelled
Yeah.
operation to just drop them in Berlin and try and save much of Eastern Europe, or at least part of Germany, from the Soviet boot.
There wasn't a plan to do that, but it was certainly an objective of the senior British politicians and commanders. So that's what Churchill wanted to do, or at least he wanted Berlin to be captured before the Russians get there. Now, Ike's interesting because towards the end of January, when they have that meeting about the broad front strategy, he knows that the Russians are going, or the Soviets are going gangbusters on their offensive from the Vistula, which gets all the way to the Oder by early February. So, and Oder is only 50 miles from Berlin. So it looks like the races, even if we wanted to, we couldn't get to Berlin before the Germans. In reality, the Russians, for various reasons, not least because they want to clean up the pockets north and south in their massive front as it's advancing into Eastern Europe, actually delay that final operation to take Berlin. So they've got to that point by early February, and they don't go any further until the 16th of April. So you do have this window of opportunity in which, not least after the initial advance out from the Rhine, where there is a very real prospect the Americans could have, if they'd wanted to, get to Berlin first. And you get this fascinating moment where Simpson, who's commanding the US Ninth Army, says to Ike, look, I'm over the Elbe at a couple of places. This is even before they meet up with the Russians. Just let me carry on to Berlin. I think I can get there in 2 days. This is even before, I think this is about the 12th of April. This is even before the Russians have launched their next offensive. And the way was relatively open. We'll never know what opposition they'd have met on the way there, but Simpson thought he could do it, and Ike said no. And he said no for two reasons. One, he didn't want to suffer the casualties he thought the armies would have to incur by going there. And Bradley was also involved in that decision, being next in rank, as it were, from Simpson. But the other thing that he tried to kind of downplay after the war, and Bradley was also responsible for this, they thought the Germans were going to create a southern redoubt, as they called it, in the Alps around Berchtesgaden, and that should be their next major strategic objective. He's thinking like Clausewitz, which is you destroy the enemy forces. You don't go for towns and locations and geographical locations. You try and destroy the enemy's ability to resist. And if they're going to set up this redoubt, we need to knock it out. But it was all a complete myth. There were a few ideas that the Germans might try and do that. A few nutcases were up for that. There was even some planning in the German high command that they might move Hitler down there at some point. But there was never a serious attempt to get a proper number of troops to fight a kind of last redoubt war. So they got it hopelessly wrong. And it probably says as much about Ike's determination to avoid casualties, actually, than it does that he genuinely thought that there was a serious objective for the armies in the southern redoubt. It was probably a little bit of both, but it was a very bad decision. Meanwhile, Churchill's thinking in the long term, which is that the Russians aren't our friends; they are our temporary allies, and there's going to be a reckoning for the whole of Europe. He knows this because of discussions with the Russians at Yalta and at Tehran, and of course soon to be in Potsdam, and that they have every intention of getting hold of bits of Eastern Europe and not relinquishing them thereafter any kind of democratic government, including Poland. So Churchill was absolutely right to be fearful of that. And he felt that the further we could go into Eastern Europe, the more protection that would give to the countries of Europe to remain under, some kind of democratic umbrella and to stop the advance of the Soviets. And last thing to say about Churchill, of course, is that he'd been absolutely paranoid about the growth of communism since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and it spread in 1918. So, this was entirely consistent with his thinking all the way along this period. But the opportunity wasn't taken. The Russians, of course, get there first, and they get to a lot of other places before the Allies too. And it's the end result, of course, is when the Iron Curtain comes down, right the way through the center of Europe.
Fascinating stuff. And another what if to speculate about. But Saul, this would be great. I mean, a guest quoting Sun Tzu, Clausewitz. This is the kind of class that we get when, Saul, you're on here. So thank you very much. The links for listeners in the show notes for Sky Warriors.
It's about to be out in paperback, actually, if I can just mention. So if anyone doesn't have a hardback, please get a hold of a paperback.
Is it out now on paperback?
It's going to be out in a couple of weeks.
Okay, great stuff. Well, links are in there, and this will be going out actually on or close to the anniversary of the operation. Thank you, Saul.
Cheers, all.
Thanks so much for listening. Please do share with friends and family, and if you can give a kind rating, I'd be most grateful. But until then, thank you, and good night.